Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reacting to
Portugal's election results explained.
This video is brought to you by Ground News. On Sunday, Portugal went to the polls for its third election in 3 years, triggered by the collapse of yet another government after yet another corruption scandal. Going into the election, the big question was whether the anti-establishment Chega party, a relatively new right-wing upstart that surged nearly 20% of the vote in the last election, could make further gains by capitalizing on the apparent shortcomings of the two main parties. However, while Chega did make some gains this time around, winning 22.6%.
So I wonder if this is like a every year thing, like election is just so often, or this is like a special elections.
The vote, arguably the real winner was the incumbent Democratic Alliance, who managed to improve their vote share by 4 points and take a plurality of seats, despite being ousted by a no-confidence vote just a few weeks ago. Nonetheless, this still leaves the Democratic Alliance with an electoral dilemma. Do they plough on with a minority government, as they did last time, or do they try and negotiate a clunky coalition? So in this video, we're going to take a look at Portugal's election results, and what might happen next.
The viral 30-second pink salt trick that melts fat was actually featured on the Today Show. But for those who
never miss an episode. European countries, since becoming a democracy in the 70s, Portuguese politics has been dominated by two parties, the more left-wing Socialist Party and the more right-wing Social Democrats. Because Portugal uses a broadly proportional electoral system, these two parties usually have to form coalitions with smaller parties in order to form a governing majority. For context, Portugal uses a proportional representation electoral system with multi-seat constituencies, with seats within these constituencies allocated via the D'Hondt method. Because the D'Hondt method implies a relatively high vote threshold, which in turn disadvantages smaller parties, this means that the big parties generally receive slightly more seats than votes. Nonetheless, the system is still broadly proportional, which means that outright single-party majorities are pretty rare in Portuguese politics. In fact, this has only ever happened 4 times. The Social Democrats won outright majorities in the 1987 and 1991 elections, and the Socialists won outright majorities in 2005 and 2022, with the 2022 victory coming under now European Council President Antonio Costa. Unfortunately for Costa, his Socialist Party was mired in an endless string of scandals, and despite having an outright majority, the government collapsed in November 2023, just 20 months into what should have been a 4-year term. Now, you might have expected the subsequent...
So I guess election's supposed to be every 4 years, but it's just a special election. Wow.
Election held in March 2024 to have been an easy win for the Social Democrats as the obvious alternative. But in part because the Social Democrats were struggling with their own corruption scandals at the time, the election ended up being remarkably close. And the big story was the rise of the new right-wing anti-establishment party called Chega, or Enough in English, who benefited from widespread antipathy towards the two main parties. Chega ended up coming third with 18% of the vote, with the Socialists on 28% and the Social Democrats, who formed the so-called Democrat Alliance with a couple of smaller centre-right parties, on just 29%. This meant that the Social Democrat-led Democratic Alliance won just 80 seats, the Socialists 78, and Chega 50, with the remaining 24 seats split between a handful of minor parties. This meant that, excluding the possibility of a grand coalition, which the Socialists immediately ruled out, the only feasible route to the 116-vote governing majority would have been a right-wing coalition between the Democratic Alliance and Chega. However, the Social Democrats' leader, and now Prime Minister Luis Montenegro, immediately ruled this out, both because he pledged not to cooperate with Chega during the campaign, and because the European People's Party, the Social Democrats grouping in the European Parliament, signalled that they consider such a coalition unacceptable. Instead, Montenegro chose to plough on with a minority government and hoped to muster sufficient support from opposition parties to pass major legislation. Originally, it looked like this might work, and in November, Montenegro managed to squeeze his first budget through Parliament, with the Socialists abstaining in the vote. However, in February, the Portuguese press reported that Montenegro's family consulting firm, that's a thing, right, had been receiving thousands...
also the name of a country.
Yeah. But so
I was like, what's Montenegro got to do with this?
his family has a consulting firm. That's a problem.
Of euros from companies looking for government contracts. In response, Montenegro called a no-confidence vote on himself, essentially daring the opposition parties to trigger yet more elections. But this backfired. On March 11th, Montenegro lost the vote and the government collapsed, making his the first government to lose such a vote since 1977. Fresh elections were then scheduled for May 18th, and originally, the conventional wisdom was that Chega would be the main beneficiary. After all, Chega is essentially an anti-establishment party, and these elections had been
Make Europe great again, huh?
been triggered by yet another corruption scandal to do with one of the two big established parties. However, that's not really what happened. With 99% of the vote counted and 226 of 230 seats called, it looks like the big winner of the night was the Democratic Alliance, who won 32.7% of the vote and at least 89 seats, nearly 10 points more than the second place Socialists, who won 23.4% of the vote and 58 seats. While Chega did improve on 2024, winning 22.6% of the vote and 58 seats, level with the Socialists, they still came third and more than 10 points behind the Democratic Alliance. So how did Montenegro pull this off? Well, it's in large part because Montenegro was able to successfully convince at least some of the electorate that the Democratic Alliance was the only party with any chance of either winning an outright majority or forming a stable government. So anyone who wanted to return to political stability and an end to the endless elections should vote for him. In fact, Montenegro made this case
That's a good approach.
Yeah, and I wonder if he's gonna be the head or he's kind of sidestepping, you know, that okay, he's resigning and somebody else is gonna be there.
Implicitly. Last week, in the final days of the campaign, he called the opposition a destructive majority that makes instability a way of life, and called for anyone who was tired of elections to vote for him. And Montenegro was very much helped here by the fact that neither the Socialists nor Chega had a great campaign themselves. The Socialists have struggled to regroup since Costa's ousting, and their current leader, Pedro Nuno Santos, who's already stepped down in the aftermath of these results, was deeply unpopular with the wider electorate. Santos, who was a government minister in the last government, has struggled to shake his association with the Socialists' previous string of scandals, and just isn't that great in front of the cameras. He also comes from the left of the Socialists, which makes him too left-wing for many of the more centrist voters. Similarly, Chega struggled to build on the momentum that they saw last time round. Their generous economic policies were widely panned as unrealistic and uncosted, and their leader, André Ventura, has been criticised for failing to come up with more positive solutions in debates. Ventura also had a bit of a moment when he had to be helped off stage after nearly passing out during a speech last week, and 3 of his own MPs were accused of various crimes earlier this year.
That's not
You get the
good.
idea then.
He don't even look that old.
Montenegro basically told voters that he was their only chance
Maybe
of stability,
third eye.
and at least some voters looked at the alternatives and agreed to lend him their votes. Nonetheless, Chega's rise still presents a structural problem for the two main parties, who will find it more difficult to form majorities than it ever used to be. And Montenegro is left with a familiar decision of whether to push on with a minority government or...
So I guess Montenegro is staying. The way I understood is that okay, he's resigning and now they're electing somebody else. But I guess they're doing election just to show face, but he's still, you know, he won,
Right,
so
call
he's
the
staying.
show.
Yeah.
try to form a clunky coalition without Chega. But forming majorities and dealing with elections is a complex and nuanced issue, and as such, there's
Can I see the comments? I wonder how people from Portugal feels.
How do you feel, guys? Calls for no confidence vote on himself, loses it, accuses opposition of instability in endless elections. Truly one of the political strategies of all times.
Wow.
I feel like 2 major points were missed here. 1, Chega might and most likely will become the second biggest party in Portugal after the last 4 seats are counted in, which is a major thing if you consider that only 3 years ago they had 7% of the total vote, and the electoral system has been bipartisan since the country became democratic.
Wow.
That is big. If in 3 years they went from 7 to 23%, that's big. Clearly they're growing. And number 2, unlike the previous scandal with Antonio Costa, polling showed that the most of the Portuguese electorate cared little about firm scandal, not only because Montenegro was not formally indicted or anything, this was just an ethical dilemma, but also because he was enjoying fairly high approval ratings before this, and there are much greater issues in the country that the electorate considers more important than the ethical dilemma.
That's true.
Yeah.
There's bigger fish to fry.
Yeah, we see issues in Portugal, yeah.
Guys, of course, let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Join the Discord. And as always, share as much kindness as possible.